That's the old Cornell library, actually. So.
Is it?
Yeah.
I didn't see your head fuzzing out like it usually does on virtual backgrounds.
It's all in the lighting and the green screen.
I see.
So people are just slowly filtering into the room. If I could just ask everybody if it's possible to turn on your video so we can actually have an interactive conversation. Thank you. And just to check, have you received the materials with the 3 separate tenure cases? Have you had a chance to look at those, or should I put those up for people to take a look at maybe?
I don't know if I received those.
I'm going to go ahead and try to put it up just so you can all see it.
Thanks, I've not received it.
Okay.
I don't see that there's something.
So that should be coming up right about now. You're able to see that, or it's okay?
Sorry,
Yeah,
I just on my email looking for any materials, which I don't.
It's okay. It should be showing up on the screen share now. So basically, the core of this exercise, there's these 3 sample tenure cases, which you can see up there. And the idea behind them basically is that this first case is kind of what you would consider the prototypical tenure case where the person is a fundamental research advance. It's kind of the classic research. The impact of their work on the field is in the narrative, and then the candidate has a significant number of publications, and some of them are highly cited in highly respected journals, all the classic markers. On the other side of this, following the same kind of paradigm that Lauren had set up in that chart, is case 3, which is a highly applied case, where the narrative in the case actually is a description of the direct societal impact the work has had. The candidate's publication record includes a moderate number of publications in journals in the field, and also they've provided evidence of direct societal impact that their work has actually had. And the candidate is in a field where external funding is needed to conduct research. Then the candidates also receive considerable funding, but mostly from industrial partners, as opposed to in the first case where it's maybe from research funding agencies. They're also regularly sought out by external organization leaders and policymakers in fields related to their research. So these are kind of prototypical fundamental basic research and fundamental applied research. The more HIBAR style case is this case number 2 in the middle, where they're doing fundamental research as opposed to applied research, but it's intended to address a particular societal problem as kind of an orienting focus for it. They've given a plausible description of the potential direct societal impact in the next 10 years, though. So they haven't had that impact on society yet. It's off in the future. Their publication record includes a moderate number of publications in somewhat respected journals, but not as much as perhaps case number 1, because they've been spending the time balanced slightly differently. And then if it's a field where funding is needed, typically the candidates receive considerable support from charitable research funding foundations in particular. On all the other factors, such as teaching, the candidates are identical. They've demonstrated deep commitment and competence in teaching. And on professional service, their service record reflects they feel their contribution to service are critical to their role as an education and researcher. So the primary differences are in this core part of the style of research and the output that they've had currently. And so the question that we're faced with or tasked with as a group is to think, what additional information would you need to know about this case number 2, the HIBAR case, to determine if it actually is a case that's worthy of tenure, beyond what would typically be in such a package like that. And just to start, are the differences in the cases clear that those are making sense?
Yes.
Yep. So I can just open it up and see what your thoughts are about, like, what types of information, if you were sitting on a departmental level committee around that, would you kind of want to know about it?
First of all, it depends on the department. So if I'm sitting in my theoretical physics department, I have a different answer to your question if I'm sitting in my engineering department.
So how do they differ? What are those 2 answers?
Well, if I'm sitting in a theoretical physics department, then case 3 is unlikely to be what I task the candidate with when they start the tenure track, and more case one is the case. And if I'm sitting in an engineering department, it's somewhere between case 2 and case 3.
And Robert, you want to say something?
No, I understand. Also being a physicist, also having been appointed in engineering school departments as well. I understand that difference. One thing that always has struck me when I've been either a vice president, an associate dean, or just in the department as a faculty member is the question of intellectual leadership, meaning whether it's fundamental or applied, to what degree has the person, the candidate, brought genuine leadership and originality to the approach. So I guess one of the things I'd look for in terms of additional information is that intellectual leadership. Has the initiative and the contribution really come from the faculty member being considered for tenure, or have they been in more of a kind of follow the leader mode and much greater emphasis on taking the incentive and the intellectual leadership to accomplish the goal?
And what are the markers you would typically consider relevant for intellectual leadership? Like what types of markers would appear for that?
Well, sometimes depending
Well, I
upon
can say that one would be intellectual property.
Intellectual property, so IP?
Right.
Correct.
Right.
Patents.
Authorship in some journals have authorship that implies leadership.
Is that in the fundamental journals or in an applied journal or just in any journal at all, or?
In both. In
Okay.
some, if you're the first author, or that often signifies that you've taken more the leadership of the study, but not in all. It depends upon the nature of the journal. But I agree very much with the IP comment too. To what, if the person has patented, were they the instigator of the patent? Were they the people that really kind of coordinated the effort? That often is more determined from letters than it is from specific evidence. So letters in support of the candidate's tenure will often indicate whether they've taken more of a leadership position or whether they've been more in a more passive responsive sort of position.
Okay. And Linda, you brought up the IP in particular. Are there particular markers of that, like specifically patents or other types of IP measures, or what types of specific measures?
Well, intellectual property would be one. The other thing that I would see as far as the professional recognition and research and scholarship, that middle bucket where you have, if the candidate is in a field where external funding is needed to conduct research, has the candidate, if it is a societal impact and they want to move something, whether they have IP or not, it depends on what the intellectual property is, but it's a trademark or whatever. What kind of reception are they getting? What is that faculty member doing to pursue either SIBR funding, STIR funding, learn about the innovation ecosystem so that they can move their idea forward and it doesn't just languish? I mean, somebody can get a patent and just let it sit there, but what are they proactively doing?
Right.
And that takes time and that takes leadership.
So it's coming back to this leadership aspect as well in terms of, and one of the things that we were trying to plug into here is the difference between case 2 versus case 3 is potentially case 3, they've already achieved those things. In case 2, perhaps it's a slightly longer term prospect, so they might not have actually secured impact for the intellectual property yet. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to address, like, if it seems like they're onto something promising, but they haven't made that fundamental discovery yet to the point of getting the patent or something such as that, what are the markers besides, the various things? You've mentioned one just now, which is like feedback in the letters, perhaps, and maybe some people are starting to recognize it. What are the other ways that we can actually measure that before it actually has that, quote, output?
Well, there's a number of funds available for, basically your go, no go kind of decision that you're going to make, whether it has legs to be in the market or pursue. So what kind of a process is that faculty member? I mean, they're going to have to learn how to do pitch decks. They're going to have to learn how to sell their science. And that doesn't come just by having a PhD. They got to learn the business side of science. So if they want to move that intellectual property, they will have a role, but they also have to acknowledge there's a business side to it, and so they may have to let other people. So it's a team effort, and what kind of role are they willing to play?
So types of process measures, in essence, like along the way to see if they're making the progress on it without necessarily having that output. Dev, you seem to have a reaction to that.
Oh, no, as someone who works between social science and science, I recognize, with my science colleagues, both here at the U of A and when I was at UBC, I think this discussion is very apt, and I see process and outcome measures that work for tenure cases. But on the social science side, I think leadership is not framed the same way or valued in the same way. Many people who are coming up for tenure, junior cases that I've sat on or promoted or written letters for, if they showed too much leadership, too much work and professional service in the field, or pushing or commercializing, they would be considered not, really sticking to their fundamental task of doing core research and writing up journal articles. So, I would say on average, it would be not until you're a later associate that you should be having the same sort of impact that I would see with my science colleagues, where, as a junior person coming out, if you're not making a mark in your field 5-7 years later in some way in your subspecialty area, then people wonder whether you really have that great idea or that key element, which I think is just more telling in those cases. So I do think there's a little bit of a divide there. But there's one other bigger issue that I've always wondered about, and I'm sure folks here have an opinion on, and that is, there's a lot of issue chasing, or what is hot and what is not chasing. And sometimes even on a 5, 7, 10-year frame, I've done work, for instance, on nanotechnology between the science departments and, and social science, and looked at nanotechnology rollouts. And nanotech was super hot. I've done work on environmental stuff, renewable energy, super hot, and then it drops. And so, you've got to also try to disentangle in HIBAR the sort of hotness factor when you're writing letters. So anyway, I just wanted to bring up the social science divide and how it's treated a little bit differently in leadership, and also the hot and what's not hot factor, which is a bit hard to disentangle on funding cycles and, for a lot of outcomes.
So Dev, on that hotness factor in particular, because some of the measures are going to be associated with how trending a particular topic is, what are the ways that you could actually predict at that early stage, other than
I like to see that folks are studying things that have been hot and not. I like to see commitment to an area, and that you're still able to get funds going forward. You might tweak it. Everybody's got to be strategic, but you're still using some of your fundamental techniques. You're still building, and I respect those cases much more, and I'm much more willing to promote those, frankly. Yeah.
So kind of intellectual consistency and integrity and these types of aspects, even if it's not trending or something like that. And Robert, you were nodding on that one. You agreed with that one?
Oh, I completely agree. I think you look for real commitment as a scholar to make a positive societal change. And whether that's fundamental or whether that's applied, at least one thing that I always tried to do as a vice chancellor or a vice president was to be sure that there was equal respect for both, that real creative activity is what we're looking for, real intellectual leadership. One example, I used to be a PI in the fundamental physics program of NASA. And so we were very much involved in publishing on fundamental physics of the quantum fluids, for example. But at the same time, instrumentation did not exist to be able to make the experimental measurements. So we had a real commitment to being in the machine shop and the electronics shop of really forging new measurement tools. And I think that one thing, at least when we were considering serving on like letter writers across this community in fundamental physics, was how committed are the people really to create the intellectual property and the new devices necessary to facilitate the fundamental measurements they're trying to make. Because in the fundamental sciences, most of the time, you can't do a store-bought purchase of a piece of apparatus. You've got to have a much more kind of transcendental determination to get into the applied metrology to be able to make the measurements. Another aspect of this, though, that really bothered me was certain departments, notoriously my own in physics and astronomy, also sometimes in chemistry, would have tenure and promotion committees that say, you know, we're only going to score highly those publications in physical review letters, Nature, Science, blah, 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 and almost create a barrier and a disregard for outstanding translational research that might be funded by, you know, foundations, even wealthy individuals. And I always thought that that was very, very short-sighted. You want to consider, you know, the quality of effort across the board, because, you know, everything from the fundamental to the highly translational and applied should be considered on the basis of its genuine merit. Has it really made a contribution or not?
Mm-hmm. One of the, this is Wes, if I could jump in, one of the things that I'd be curious in hearing from each of you about is, you know, it's just part of this thing of what was discussed in terms of disentangling things. You know, I see lots of fundamental work done on the theoretical side, good leadership there, but who takes it and runs with it? You know, what kind of valuation does that get in the tenuring process? Similarly, NASA collects terabytes of data. What merit, what value, what credence does the person who digs into that and tries to make sense of it? You know, you're getting in that case 2 realm where it isn't just, you know, cranking out some applied thing that's put immediately to work, but it's trying to figure out, you know, making sense of what is the meaning of this host of data that has been collected.
And Wes, how would you actually, like, what types of questions would you ask them to help determine if they're doing that successfully?
Well, that's, I guess, what I have as much of a question as a comment on that. One of the things that I think bears at least to some degree on this issue of are you really leading in the field is, you know, are people picking up on what this person is doing? Are you seeing citations to their work, whether they're in the most highly respected journal or not? Are you enough out there at the leading, bleeding edge that people are picking up on it and seeing value and wanting to take it the next step? Those sorts of things seem to me to be measures of leadership, measures of societal contribution as well, which is, you know, what we're dealing with here, and it seems in the HIBAR realm.
So Andy, when Wes just said measures of societal on the citations, you looked up as if you were thinking about something there. Curious what you were thinking.
I mean, yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, that's obvious. But ultimately, in this specific case of tenure track, the problem is that the assistant prof, essentially, they're worried about their mortgage and they're getting paid, and are their kids going to be able to go to a good school, right? So this problem has to be addressed way down the line. So the you know, higher education is probably one of the most conservative industries, if you like, that's out there, because there's so little at stake, as we say, in that we can play with research and do what we want. So most higher education institutes have goals for their assistant profs. We certainly do. That probably have not changed in 30 or 40 years. Now, I know that one of the aims of this discussion is how we can convince universities to, particularly in the STEM areas, to do that. But one, it's going to be discipline specific, and two, that's going to be a very hard discussion to have, I think.
So if you take one discipline that you're familiar with, what would be the particular information you would actually ask for? You had mentioned
absolutely.
yeah.
I like Robert. I'm not quite as esteemed physicist as Robert. I mean that with absolute respect. I'm familiar with some of his work, but I'm a physicist, and physicists are by nature, how can I put this? I am a physicist, so we are by nature somewhat arrogant and aloof. And so the first thing we're going to look at,
well.
yeah, thank you, Robert. So we think we know best, right? And there are many physicists and engineering physicists and applied physicists, or mostly physicists, I guess, who would take, to unfairly paraphrase Feynman, but why do we do physics at universities, right? It's the fun of finding stuff out. And that's in one, and out of that will come good stuff naturally and organically. And this, to a physicist, what you're asking here is to sort of play with a loaded deck and try and circumvent good mathematical, rigorous physics for some sort of a fast track. So those are my sort of thoughts on that. So when I'm sitting on a tenure and promotion committee, I'm doing everything that I can't remember if it was Robert or Wes said not to do. I think it was Robert. I'm looking at how many phys rev lets does the guy have, and is there a couple of Nature papers in there? Who do you collaborate with, and how much money have you brought in? And then that's it, right? Because those are the natural bars that we use to determine excellence. And in the end, what we're interested in as physicists is excellence above all else.
Mm-hmm.
So the traditional metrics, that would be basically the case one would fare the best on those, and then case 2 or 3 would be problematic in essence.
No, not necessarily. I think, but if there are no if there are no publications that show me that an assistant prof is on a track to excellence, when you should ultimately be your most productive as an assistant prof, because you've got the ultimate skin in the game, in that you may not be able to pay your mortgage after 6 years. If that person's not achieved excellence in that time, then I'm afraid it's my opinion is they're probably in the wrong job, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a lot to ask an assistant prof to take a gamble to do that. So I buy into the HIBAR ideas, but you're asking a lot of people who are not us, as in older guys who are secure and established, to take all the risk here.
Dev, you wanted to say something there?
Yeah, I agree with Andy. I mean, I think on the social science side, there's risk as well. Again, I think the excellence path may be slightly different, just traditionally based on how the disciplines are set up. But I wanted to just raise, not to complexify it, but I think paths for women with families might be a little bit different too on HIBAR at the assistant level. And so I've never been sure about whether HIBAR was just raising too high a bar if you're also have kids and this and that. And then you're supposed to be doing long-term research and you're supposed to be hitting excellence. I mean, then the risk factor goes up even more. So I don't know. I just wanted to raise it. I didn't want to have it left aside as an issue in the room. So that's all.
Okay. So
I mean, I've got my wife's, by the way, a professor.
Yeah.
So we've got kids, and so I've watched some of this journey and the difference in the journey. So yeah.
So I see that they're pulling us back in 20 seconds. So I just want to just get the rough summary here. Like, it sounds like there was a consistency around intellectual leadership. The measurements of that sound like to a certain extent, they're in the classic journal types of outlets or funding or intellectual property, those markers and predictive of that, as well as letters to a large extent to position the work. And we've just been pulled back. So I think
That's my group. Hey, group.
Hey there.
Okay. Lauren, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Thank you.
Okay.
And I unmuted. Host. Can you hear me?
yes.
Yes.
Hey. It's so funny that so many of us, you know, I'm a visiting professor in the business college on social entrepreneurship, but it's so interesting that so many of the people in the discussions have been in the entrepreneur side of the house. I didn't realize that until I sort of went through everybody's bio. Neat.
So just to clarify, Richard, you're going to be pulling everybody back to get the feedback from the various groups now.
Somehow I didn't realize I was doing the last piece, but that's good.
Okay.
No problem.
It's not the last piece. It's just the leading the discussion on what we just did there.
Right. No, then it goes into yours, right, Jerry? You're at my alma mater, so treat it nicely.
We.
So I think everybody has made it back into the room and we can get started. So Richard, I'll hand it off to you.
Okay, thank you. So I don't know if we have numbers for our group or how we identify the others groups, but I would go last.
Well, I think they were numbered. Yeah.
Okay, so group number 1. It's probably me. Group 2.
I was in group 2, and Colleen Parker took the notes for us.
Yep. So do you want me to run through the notes?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we reviewed the 3 cases that were found in the documentation before the program about the fundamental researcher, the HIBAR researcher, and then the applied researcher. And we discussed questions to ask, and we came up with a number of questions. And Lauren, correct me if I'm phrasing this incorrectly, but questions involved, are there partners involved? What kind of networks do the partners have? Are they closely connected to those using the results of the project? We also talked about what kind of network does the researcher have with the academic community? Is the network with lead scholars with proven track records? An important criteria might be the quality of the network, but we should also be sure to think about issues of diversity and inclusion. Are there immediate milestones that have been met? Duration of the project may be an issue. How do you determine progress? Who is an external expert that could assist with this case? The external commenter would be someone familiar with HIBAR research and familiar with the problem. Has a researcher carefully explained the science problem to be solved, articulating the problem and the project plan and vision? And has the researcher constructed a collaboration with different types of stakeholders interested in advancing this research?
That's really good.
Thank you so much, Colleen.
That's great. Thank you. I think we'll go on to 3 and not take comments in between. Is that right, Lauren? Mark David said yes. So group number 3.
So actually, I was in group number 3. We had a mixture across the fields of the STEM, several from physics and several from social science as well. One of the largest questions that came out, without a specific measure for it, but what it was trying to get into the measurement was intellectual leadership, which was still loosely defined in terms of what that means, or how to measure it. And we went around several different things around how you might be able to measure intellectual leadership. Some of the markers that group number 2 was talking about popped up as well. Some of the clear ones that came out, though, were aspects of, for certain fields of intellectual property that actually gets generated. So the actual intellectual property, the letters that come in particular were quite relevant for some, and then funding, the types of funding that come in as well. There wasn't as much discussion about the networks as in group number 2, but there was some mention of collaborations to see who they were partnering with and what types of progress that would produce for later. There was a great concern raised about the risk generally of asking assistant professors generally to engage with this, and as well across demographic diversity, depending on the individual family situations and all of that as well. The one other aspect that came out was consistency. So there was a discussion about people that just jumped onto trendy applied topics as opposed to actually doing rigorous ongoing work where they stay true to the work and actually committed to doing it longer term. And that hotness factor in terms of like the trendiness was actually generally perceived as a negative. If people were just jumping from trendy topic to trendy topic and instead demonstrating consistency for something that maybe was trendy and has already come back down and then still is making advances with that. And then the one thing that came out around the publications, several mentioned that getting publications in the top academic journals is still critical, no matter where, no way around that. So that raises the issue of the journals themselves in terms of what can be addressed in those prestigious journals for actually taking more of that type of work in, so they can get some of the classic markers that go through the regular types of mechanisms, and possibly just have different types of work appear in those particular types of outlets. So that's one of the action levers that popped out there. And the other, the last criteria that came out was actually the creative aspect in terms of demonstrating that the person actually had a creative, independent voice around it as well, where they bring creative solutions to the field. And that possibly is a byproduct of it. Measurements on that are difficult though, because it basically came back to opinions of others and how those opinions are evaluated around it. A lot of ambiguous measures, so not a lot of clarity. I'm sorry. Off to group number 4.
All right,
Off to group number 4.
I am group number 4, and we also had a pretty diverse group. We had someone studying blockchains, a physician and psychologist, someone in charge of faculty success, an electrical engineer, and me. I'm kind of an amateur sociologist, so we had a quite diverse group there. And we went through sort of the standard measures that one would look for in tenure cases: publications, citations in Google Scholar, funding. There's a little ambiguity about how much patents should count. But we also had, if I can call Barbara out specifically, she had some really interesting experiences in having led highly interdisciplinary projects with people in really different fields, but successfully. She said they were able to take a highly interdisciplinary project and still each one managed to claim a component of it, to have ownership of different pieces of it, but coordinating it in such a way that they could go back to their own individual fields, publish successfully disciplinary work, but also contribute to the greater whole. And the key is the ability to organize a group in a way that everyone can make contributions like that. And how do you evaluate work like that? It's being able to show what you have individually contributed. Yes, you're part of a highly interdisciplinary group, but you need to be able to make a clear case as a candidate. Here's the part that I contributed. That said, there was a strong sense, no publications, no tenure, that our sad candidate number 2, if they have a promise of future impactful publications, is probably not gonna work. Although the nature of what those publications could be might also include artistic performances or patents or something like that. And also funding seemed to be non-negotiable. Now, one thing that Chang added that was really interesting was the ability to engage effectively with industry partners. And I think that also fed into the notion of the ability to get funding. That partly what you're doing as a tenure candidate is not just I've published and gotten cited, but I am able to persuade smart people who know what they're talking about in industry or at funding agencies that I know what I'm doing, and that should count in some sense toward tenure in addition to publications.
Really good. So
Number 5.
Number 5. I don't. There is no 5, right?
No, I think it's back to you, Richard.
Yeah. So I thought. Unfortunately, it's back to me. So we had a wonderful group, and we're not going to do justice to them, so I apologize at the beginning. But it was so interesting that it's sort of innate in HIBAR that there will be teams. And as we began to really spend more time about teams, it became clear that the impact of being able to put a team together and lead such a team needs to be recognized. And again, everyone's been talking about, I did my part, I got it published over here or there. But there's not recognition of the leadership or what it takes to put a team. And that may be something that needs to be included in terms of leadership as we begin to think through it. The second thing, again, as we began to talk about it, came out about difficulties in a team in many universities. For instance, the principal investigator is a single person, and all the money from that grant or project goes to that department, and that department receives the overhead. So sometimes the incentive for the other team members and their department seems to not be taken into account, and sometimes sort of is not what we would call an incentive to partnerships. And maybe we ought to take a look at that particular issue. And again, the idea of if it's a team should lead to more papers, et cetera, but often measuring, quote, impact is difficult. There was a suggestion that you can almost tie any impact to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and at least that would give some direction. Because the other thing that was the question about reviewing had something to do with, do you believe in the trajectory of this work? Is this work really moving forward and making significant progress, or is, as somebody else mentioned earlier, is it a blip and going to go away, or et cetera? And I think that the other question came out about again, it comes back to partnerships. Some of the partnerships are outside the academic world, and some of the letters of support may come from outside the academic world. And are they valued or not valued? And we even talked about how can people from the inside value those? Do any of the tenure committees have people from outside the academic community as part of that evaluation process? And maybe that would at least provide some more strength about partnerships and the value of partnerships and interpretations of partnerships. And again, the last one was that no matter how we came back, we all came back to whether it's if you're the first on the author or not first on the author, it came to a very limited number of acceptable publications that count. And until one does something with that, that sort of issue, it's going to be very difficult to do things that really spread into a wider circle of acceptable publications. And again, I'd like to thank Michelle because she wrote that all up, so it wasn't me at all that had that review. But that's where we are, and I think provides, again, listening to the 4 groups, it's really interesting how I think we've learned a lot in this very short time about what's going on, what are some of the incentives, and what are some of the problems. But I think we've gone beyond my time limit, and I have to turn it over to Jerry at this point. Is that correct?
All right, so I'm going to call an audible here. We're going to truncate our discussion a bit and keep it down to maybe, Jade, what do you think? 10-ish minutes for this next one?
Yeah,
Okay.
that would be perfect.
All right, thank you. Because we want to leave enough time for sort of global discussion among the folks here. In our group, not everyone was super familiar with what the tenure review process looks like. So I wanted to share with you the horror that is the tenure review process. So when I was at Columbia University in New York, this was the painting on my wall. It's a Byzantine painting showing the ladder to heaven. And you'll notice there's these people who mean well trying to make it through the tenure system. And then there's these devils off to the right. And at every step, there's someone who's going to pull you off the ladder. There's the department, and there's the school promotion and tenure committee. And then there's those outside letter writers who have a bow and arrow to take you out. And then the university ad hoc, and then the provost and the president. None of them ever lifts you up. They all just pull you out along the way. So sorry for any junior faculty, but this is a tragic world that you're living in. Certainly at Columbia University, there are lots of stories of people making it all the way to the provost and then getting knocked off. Part of the complication of this system is how do you evaluate people who are in really different fields? Because your provost might be a lawyer, they might be an economist, they might be a medical doctor, they might be a social worker, and you need to persuade them that the work that you're doing is important and impactful for the world. The case that we're contemplating here is someone who has devoted their last 3 years to work on COVID, something that we really need high quality, HIBAR research on. And in some cases, it's straightforward. We're using a vacuum cleaner bag to make a ventilator. But our middle candidate is doing something that's a bit more complicated. They don't necessarily have a portfolio of patents yet. So how do you persuade each of these folks along the way, given that they have different disciplinary backgrounds? How do you persuade someone who is not in your field that this is high quality, high bar, tenurable research? And so the question we want for the second breakout, and we're going to do a bit shorter than we thought, which is just fine, is what is the one question or the set of questions that would be most helpful for evaluating the tenure worthiness at the university level? So we're putting on you're sitting in that interdisciplinary group of people who speak very different academic languages. What is the thing that you would need to see demonstrated to make that person tenure worthy? So does that make sense as a question? Or you can pipe up if it doesn't make any sense and then we'll rephrase it. But that's sort of the question is, what is the strongest question or the strongest flavor of evidence that a candidate could provide that their work fits, even if they're not in your own field? Okay? So I'm going to paste this into the chat. And then we can head off into our different groups, and we'll again have, I hope, quick report outs on that.
Great.
Make sense?
Yes, so I'm going to open the rooms now. Thank you.
So I'm going to paste this. People might want to cut and paste that question, and that can guide their conversations.
Welcome back. And you're both on mute. Everybody's on mute, actually, just to let you know.
I should be off. I'm
Oh,
hope.
Now you're off. Yep, there you are. Okay. So apologies if I didn't get everything summarized there. It was a short format. Welcome back, Andy. I see you. And Wes, I think you're unmuted on your phone there, so I think we're good. So Jerry has just charged us with basically a very similar question to what we asked last time around, but this time is actually when it's somebody in a field that you're not familiar with in particular. So last time we were talking about the disciplinary differences, and now this is actually at the higher committee levels where perhaps you're sitting on the university-wide committee and you see somebody from a totally different field. So, I mean, for the case of this group, maybe some of the physicists see some of Dev's social scientists or sociologists or whatever it may be. And maybe for Dev, he sees a theoretical particle physicist that's doing applied work. I'm not sure how that works because I'm not from that area. But what would you actually want to see in particular? Like, I'm assuming we're going to be going back to some of our original criteria, but how would you actually understand that those were true if they weren't in a field where you actually do understand what the differences are between the journals or the intellectual property or these various other metrics that we were talking about earlier. What do you think? Robert, you're nodding, so you have an idea?
Well, yes, I can relate to this because many years ago, maybe 20 years ago, when I was Associate Dean for Research in Arts and Sciences at the University of New Mexico, there was exactly this case. A young woman who was ahead of her normal progression because she was quite accomplished, seeking tenure in English. And she had taken very bold stances. She had really gone against the norm, and a lot of people took great interest in her work. And it had substantial societal impact. But it was interesting because she was picked up by the New York Times and their book review and everything else. She induced a lot of jealousy among the more senior faculty who were evaluating her in the English department. And also, since her methods and her approach was unconventional, she was almost seen as obscene in a sense by the more conventional people in her department. And so I guess one thing to answer this direct question is intellectual boldness, the ability to take on and to push the envelope, not to create noise, of course, but to create positive societal change or to create greater prosperity or utility. And even though I'm certainly not an English professor, in fact, I jokingly say English is the only foreign language I speak, you know, I think that it's an important thing to note of scholars, whether they have that intellectual boldness, that commitment, that thick skin and staying power to really make a difference in their work. And I guess that's what I look for across disciplinary lines.
So basically challenging the status quo in their own field in particular.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Just to clarify, so in that particular case, using that as an example, the fact that the conservative department was not viewing it positively actually made it more desirable to you at that senior level to say, hey, maybe she's breaking new grounds here, that type of thing?
Absolutely. I, again, was the associate dean. The dean was was also an English professor. He was the second most published person in a 53-person faculty. And he was still, you know, day in, day out with the full dean responsibilities, which he did quite well. Very determined and driven person. So the department went negative, actually, against her tenure. And the college went positive, and the provost agreed with the college. And again, the main thing was the criteria for promotion were deviating from scholarship, teaching, and service, and going into these questions of whether you're kind of pulling the societal line in the department or not. And so that was also, I think, a very strong indication that the judgment of some of the more senior faculty were kind of straying from the real requirements for tenure.
And Andy, Wes, or Dev, thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree. I would actually say that the first word that you used, Robert, of impact, societal impact, is the key, and the boldness is a way to generate the impact. So I think in all tenure cases, it's has this person made a difference? Have they made an impact? The problem I've had, even within an engineering faculty, we have 8 departments, and mechanical engineers judge impact completely different from applied physicists. And the good deans will say, well, I've selected my T&P committee such that I can look at you, Mr. Mechanical Engineer or Professor Mechanical Engineer, and tell me what is a reasonable impact in mechanical engineering, and has this person met the bar? So the problem, I guess, with having just a general statement on impact is that's subjective to the university, the faculty, and the department, and you somehow have to put boundaries around that. But how that's sort of I would need time to process the the specific case that Robert put forward on the English professor there about how you would gauge. Certainly, it sounds like the professor had impact, but why were so many people? It's like I can make a lot of noise by coming out with some crazy ideas as a physicist, right? But does that make me a good physicist? Anyway, so long answer to short question, I would say impact is the key word, societal impact.
Dev, you look like you're thinking.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that I haven't seen as many divisive cases at the junior level once it gets to the university committee as at the full level. Because when it gets to be full, people are looking for international impact, real standing leadership in field, whether it's in social science or science. And so then people tend to weigh in quite a bit more across disciplines, I've found, as opposed to, on a junior case, they'll go, oh, well, that department really knows. And so the one where the department was against is quite an interesting case, because then you can't default to that. But I oftentimes find the default to be just, at the junior, if the department's pretty strong and they're A-level journals, then everything's okay, and we'll go forward. But even as things become full or mid to full, then all of a sudden other departments will more strongly weigh in and kind of go, well, this, like in the science departments will oftentimes go, this is a paltry number of publications. I mean, this number of publications alone is not what we see in sciences, because oftentimes the rate is 4 to 6 per year when you're in productive years, whereas the rate's 2 to 3 in social science, per productive year. So some of the conversation will start there, and some of the conversation will go, well, there are these 3 papers, but I see citation index that to me looks a little fluky, because sometimes you'll see social science index that is very high in terms of numbers. It's just routinely higher, but then those science hits that are very high are very, very high. So it's very bifurcated in science like this and social sciences like this. And so then people start arguing about citation counts and meaning citations. So I just find that the HIBAR ironically becomes more difficult at the university level as you become mid and later career. Yeah, I just wanted to bring that up just by way of observation. I'm 62 years old. I've been in the field for 33 years as a prof, and so I've seen a lot of different ones out there, different cases. So yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting to hear some of these comments. I would say, Robert, the woman got lucky in a way, I think, being in your group. I'm a mining engineer, by the way, and by background, and a couple of things that I've been listening to, some of these criteria coming forward that, I think the largest classical example is that it worked pervasively against the people who originated the ideas and promoted the ideas of what now is uniformly accepted, more or less, of continental drift. They couldn't even publish in any journal. So that was the first hurdle they had to overcome, that it was just cartoon drawing and puzzle making and all sorts of disparaging commentary there. So that, I come back to some things that were mentioned in our earlier session, how to articulate it up at this higher multidisciplinary level is always a question, always a challenge, but creativity, the novelness of the approach, I think, is really important. Another area that I saw this play out when I was in graduate school, actually, is in how does rock break, rock fracture, extraordinarily difficult kind of a problem to deal with. You had the theoretical physics-based folks who had a model, and it was promoted, highly published, and then you had the group of people who are actually trying to break rock, and those didn't line up real well, and again, as I think of what Lauren and his colleagues are pushing here in the HIBAR arena, it was in finally marrying those two schools of thought up, where we really began to see progress in that field. And that was a battle hard won. That goes beyond creativity to really looking at some of those factors that were mentioned earlier of stick-to-itiveness, of not chasing what may be, at that time we were saying what was fashionable, but also what is the status quo. Now, having said that, I think Andy makes a very good point as well that, you know, how does this high-level group up at the provost and president's level, how do they sort through something being creative and novel and leading edge, and not just somebody coming up with some crazy ideas? Because back again to the example of continental drift, there's a fairly well-renowned professor, I think he's still working there, at Santa Cruz, and he has all these ideas about predicting earthquakes that are just demonstrably flat out garbage. But he gets that stuff published because it just looks so creative in its nature. So I don't know, that's helped, just a bit of a, I guess, a cautionary tale there, but also to reinforce the novelty of things has to come into play here, the creative nature and that cross-disciplinary nature where we see, not just cross-disciplinary, but even within the discipline where we see two schools of thought begin to come together.
So I don't know if that just popped across your screen also. Did you just get the breakout warning?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just very quickly, the ideas that I've jotted down from our brief discussion are the boldness against old norms, or the creativity, kind of tying that together, but in a legitimate way where it actually is believable that it's actually proper as opposed to wacky or too crazy. Societal impact, however we can again measure that and evaluate that. And then as well, the international impact, particularly when you get up to the higher levels. So at the assistant level to tenure, there's a lot more deferring to the departmental norms, whereas at the more senior levels, they start to maybe meddle a little bit more in terms of actually questioning the criteria. And with 5 seconds, I'll see you back in the big room.
Right.
All right, I think we are all, let me just check. Looks like we are mostly back, and we're down to 6 minutes. So I'm gonna be the very image of efficiency here. Luckily, I'm at a business school and we're all about efficiency. All right, maybe that's false. But it looks like given the timing that we've got, we're gonna have to keep it at the tweet size level. What is the one core insight that you gained from your group? And I'll just do group one first.
Richard, you're muted.
I would say our core one was the dichotomy between who we're trying to serve and solve their problem, whatever type of social problem it is, and the system of reviewing research or promotions or even how good a job I'm doing is sometimes not in sync to begin with. And that's where we need to really work at.
Great. All right. The second group.
Colleen, would you like to summarize, or would you like me to, or what's good? I didn't hear you.
Yep, you're unmuted now, Colleen.
How's that?
Buena.
Great. Lauren, all to you.
Well, thanks. I'll be very brief. I think the main thing that we, and correct me if I'm wrong, other members of the group, but I think one of the main insights in our conversation, and there was a bit of overlap of people, so that was very helpful, was the recognition of just the fundamental difference of some aspects of promotion and tenure at different levels. By the way, we've also noticed in previous conversations, there's a lot of unfamiliarity between these levels, which is surprising because at the senior level, people often came from previous cases at lower levels. But anyway, in particular, the biggest difference is the fraction of people in the room at the senior level that understand the technology or the science or the research in question is low. And the exciting thing is that might be a positive in terms of them appreciating the relevance to society, social impact, creative approaches, networking, everything like that. But again, the danger is whenever you've got a group of people that don't have clear metrics saying that they know what it looks like when they see it, there's all kinds of risks in terms of various forms of unfairness. And we did not have an answer for that. So, anything to add that anybody would like to throw in?
Right, who's the third group?
Yeah, so we had some similar discussions around that. One of the things that came out was that there's a real difference between the tenure decision versus the professor decision, the full professor decision. And there was a little bit of a feeling that at the tenure decision, there was a lot more deferral to the departmental experts and less meddling or like counter activity. Whereas at the full, there's more of a willingness to step in and say, hey, what's the real international reputation or the real societal impact at this point? And there's more expectations of actual performance at that point, as opposed to prospects of performance being judged at the lower level. There was one interesting case that came out about a professor that was turned down entirely for tenure by the departmental level, but the senior committee actually saw the societal value of it. It was one of these, you know it when you see it, and they reacted positively, and actually the person did get tenure and moved through it positively. But that was based on the boldness and the reaction of going against established norms of a very conservative department. So there's probably some institutional embeddedness there in terms of the reputation of the department among other departments. Going against that department was actually a positive thing for that particular case, it sounded like. And I don't want to take any more time. I'll pass it off to group number 4 there.
Okay, well, I'm group 4. I'll be very quick. Another fascinating discussion with highly diverse experts. And I'd say that the core insight that we had was that it's really hard to make sense of other fields when you're at that level. There was sort of a great disagreement about whether you absolutely had to have a single authored paper, or a single authored paper showed you're a sociopath and can't play well with others. And so there was a lot of diversity. And the thing that we landed on, which is what universities land on, is you defer to experts in that person's field and hope they know what they're talking about. So we have to rely on experts in sociology or epidemiology or what have you, and hope that they know what they're talking about. The addition that was novel for our group was, what about if you write to experts who are themselves HIBAR researchers? So it's not just experts in the field, but people familiar with the standards of HIBAR, and get their opinions on whether this kind of work counts. I'm supposed to have 50 minutes to finish up, and I've actually got 30 seconds, so I'll try and be really brief here. First, thanks to everyone for joining us. These were way too short, but super stimulating conversations. And I think we're at a really critical time. COVID has demonstrated that we are facing crazy demands in the world that require interdisciplinary solutions. The only ones who can do this are universities. Businesses are not going to do it. Government, certainly in lower North America, we are not going to rely on the federal government to come up with insightful and compassionate solutions. There's a nonpartisan claim there. We really need universities and what they have to do. And universities are the only ones that can get collaborative cross-disciplinary groups to do this kind of effort. We're also facing demands from society to demonstrate that what we do is worth it. Right there to the west of British Columbia is a state called Alaska that is cutting their university system, dropping majors, merging campuses, because universities are just too expensive and they're filled with people that can't demonstrate their value. This really is a moment for us to step up as a collective to take on these issues. And I just want to commend to all of you what HIBAR Research Alliance is up to, as really trying to take the reins of this critical problem that we're all facing. We are kind of the solution we're looking for if we can organize ourselves well. but we got to fix the promotion standards. We got to fix the culture and the incentive system to make this kind of work valuable going forward. So thank you for being part of this conversation. We hope to follow up with you later with some insights that we gained from this conversation. I'll just point you to the HIBAR website to keep up with the work that we're up to. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, Nicholas, this is the after party.
Yeah, I always hang out to the very end to see what happens. Have a good day.
Thanks. Au revoir.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Nicholas was great in our group, by the way.
Yeah, he's a postdoc in my school.
Yeah, no, he said.
Oh, nice.
But he was fun. Didn't you think he was fun, Michelle?
Great. Very, very helpful.
Very good.
Yes, you should hire him wherever you are.
Well, this was really insightful, and I want to commend you all for a fabulous job in reeling people back in. I apologize for the first breakout session. I was under strict instruction to keep it to 20 minutes, but it seems like it was a lively discussion overall. So we'll be sending out a post-meeting survey, but if there is any additional materials or content you would like for me to share in that email, I'd be happy to include it. So the website that you mentioned, Jerry, or any other meeting materials, or if you wanted to recap the conversation, I believe Michelle has all of the meeting participants' names and emails.
Great. So are you suggesting that we should contact them directly, or?
Well, if you can filter it through us,
Sure.
so
Yeah.
we can have it all in one place. I'll be sending out an email, probably, I don't know how